The role older people are expected to accept, and why you should refuse it begins quietly, not with an argument or a decision, but with a feeling that arrives without asking permission, a faint sense that something has shifted, even though nothing obvious has changed, that the day looks the same, the room looks the same, the routines remain intact. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, a small piece of authorship has loosened, not enough to trigger alarm, not enough to name, but enough to notice when you pause long enough to feel the space where certainty used to sit, because there was a time when choosing felt automatic, when deciding did not require reflection, when you moved through the day with an unspoken confidence that your preferences mattered simply because they were yours. And now there are moments when choice arrives already shaped, already softened, already interpreted by someone else before it reaches you, offered kindly, gently, with a tone that suggests ease. Yet beneath that ease there is a subtle removal, a quiet adjustment of position, like a chair being moved a few inches back from the table without announcement, and you find yourself leaning forward without quite knowing why, wondering when that distance appeared, because nothing dramatic has happened, no crisis, no confrontation, no loss that demands attention, only a gradual thinning of the space where your decisions once lived, a space that now feels shared in ways you never agreed to. And this realization does not arrive as anger. It arrives as confusion, as a pause mid-thought, when you realize that a decision you assumed was yours has already been discussed, scheduled, optimized, simplified, and placed neatly in front of you, as if the work of choosing has been relieved. And you are meant to feel grateful for the relief, even though part of you notices that relief is not the same as respect, that ease is not the same as dignity, that being spared effort is not the same as being trusted. And this awareness does not accuse anyone. It does not name villains because the people involved often mean well. Their voices carry concern rather than command. But concern has its own gravity, and over time it pulls authority away from its original center, not by force but by habit, by repetition, by the slow normalization of small adjustments that seem harmless in isolation, until you look back and cannot remember the last time someone asked what you wanted without already knowing the answer they expected to hear. And this is where the shift begins. Not in the body, not in strength, not in capacity, but in the atmosphere around you, in the way conversations are framed, in the assumptions that hover quietly before words are spoken, in the slight hesitation that appears when you express a preference that does not align with what has been pre-selected for you. And you sense it immediately, the pause, the recalibration, the gentle redirection. And you find yourself considering whether it is worth insisting, whether the effort of asserting is worth the subtle friction it creates, because insisting now seems to require explanation, justification, reassurance, as if choice itself has become suspicious, and you begin to notice how often you let it go, how often you nod, how often you accept the suggestion because it seems easier. And because part of you has been taught that ease is kindness, that resistance is unnecessary, that harmony matters more than authorship, yet beneath that agreement there is a faint residue, a sense that something small has been conceded, not enough to mourn, not enough to protest, but enough to accumulate, because accumulation is how autonomy erodes, not through loss, but through delegation, not through defeat, but through accommodation. And this is what makes it difficult to name, because nothing is taken from you. It is simply carried for you, and carried again, until you forget the weight, until you forget that the weight was once yours, until you forget that carrying it was part of knowing who you were. And this forgetting does not announce itself. It blends into routine, into language, into the way plans are made around you instead of with you, into the way your time is discussed as available, adjustable, flexible, as if it belongs to a broader schedule now, and you may catch yourself asking permission for things you never asked permission for before. Small things, ordinary things, like changing the order of the day, like declining an invitation, like choosing rest over obligation. And each time it happens, there is a rational explanation, a reason that sounds reasonable, practical, caring. But reason can still produce loss, and care can still rearrange power. And this is the moment that awareness begins to take shape, not as resistance but as recognition, the recognition that autonomy does not vanish with age, it becomes negotiable. And once it becomes negotiable, it becomes conditional. And once it becomes conditional, it begins to shrink. Not because you are incapable, but because others slowly learn that you will accept less, that you will yield without conflict, that you will adapt. And adaptation has always been your strength, but here it becomes a liability, because the same flexibility that once allowed you to endure now allows others to decide, and you sense the contradiction without yet resolving it. You feel capable, yet treated as fragile, experienced, yet managed, present, yet spoken about as if you were slightly absent. And this dissonance produces a quiet fatigue, not of the body, but of the self. A fatigue that comes from constantly adjusting your internal posture to fit expectations that were never clearly stated. And you realize that the role being prepared for you is not imposed openly. It is suggested through tone, through rhythm, through repetition, through the assumption that you will not mind, that you will understand, that you will appreciate the effort being made on your behalf. And because you do understand, because you do appreciate effort, because you are not interested in conflict, you accept it, and acceptance becomes the path through which the role solidifies, not as a title, not as a declaration, but as an unspoken agreement that you never consciously signed. And awareness, when it finally arrives, does not bring clarity at first. It brings unease, a sense of standing slightly outside your own life, watching it move forward on a track that feels familiar, yet not entirely chosen. And you begin to notice how language shifts around you, how phrases soften, how instructions disguise themselves as suggestions, how decisions are framed as conclusions rather than questions, and you begin to hear the difference between being asked and being informed, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it, because it repeats, because it settles, because it becomes the background hum of daily interaction. And the hum is subtle enough that others may not notice it at all, but you do, because it speaks directly to your sense of self, to the quiet understanding of who holds the final say. And you realize that the expected role is not passivity. It is compliance dressed as comfort. It is gratitude replacing agency. It is the expectation that you will step back gracefully, that you will make room, that you will allow others to take the lead without challenge. And none of this is stated openly, which is why it works. Because refusal would require you to refuse something that was never formally offered. And so the awareness grows slowly, patiently, like a light turning on in a room you have been sitting in for years, revealing not a single dramatic change, but a collection of small rearrangements, each one minor, each one understandable, each one cumulative. And you sit with this awareness without yet acting on it, because action is not the point. Not yet. Because the first task is simply to see, to acknowledge that the role exists, that it has been forming around you quietly, that it has been shaped by habit, by care, by assumption, by fear of discomfort, by fear of appearing difficult, by fear of seeming ungrateful. And you recognize that these fears are not weaknesses. They are social instincts that once served you well, but now they are being used to reposition you. And the awareness of this does not demand rebellion. It demands honesty. Honesty with yourself about what feels different, about what feels diminished, about what feels less yours than it once did. And you allow that honesty to settle without judgment, without urgency, because this stage is not about change, it is about seeing clearly, about naming internally what has shifted, about admitting that autonomy is not something that disappears overnight. It is something that fades in the presence of convenience, that thins under the weight of good intentions, that recedes when no one notices its absence. And now you notice, and that noticing, however quiet, is the beginning, not of resistance, but of internal alignment. The moment when you stop dismissing the feeling as imagination, the moment when you accept that something real has changed, not in your worth, not in your capacity, but in the way the world has begun to relate to your choices. And awareness rests there steady, unresolved but awake, waiting for nothing, simply present, simply attentive, simply unwilling to pretend that nothing is happening anymore. Recognition arrives without drama, without a single moment you can point to, because it unfolds through repetition, through the quiet alignment of many small moments that begin to form a pattern. Once you allow yourself to see them together, and what you recognize first is not malice, but method, not intention, but structure. The way help enters your life gently and stays, the way concern wraps itself around choice until choice becomes unnecessary, and unnecessary becomes inappropriate. And inappropriate becomes quietly discouraged, because recognition is not about blaming anyone. It is about noticing how often assistance arrives already carrying assumptions, how often it speaks in the language of efficiency, safety, simplicity, and how easily those words slide into authority without announcing themselves. Because when help is framed as care, it bypasses resistance. And when it bypasses resistance, it reshapes power without friction. And you begin to see how this happens in ordinary exchanges, in small negotiations that no longer feel like negotiations at all, because the outcome is implied before the conversation begins, and you are invited not to decide but to agree, and agreement feels polite, reasonable, mature, while disagreement feels disruptive, unnecessary, slightly embarrassing, as if insisting on your own preference requires an explanation that others do not need to provide. And you notice how the explanations are always framed around protection, around reducing burden, around avoiding difficulty, and none of these are false, yet together they form a logic that positions you as someone whose choices require supervision, whose judgment benefits from guidance, whose autonomy is now conditional upon reassurance. And this is where recognition sharpens, because you realize that the role is not one of weakness, it is one of managed competence, where your ability is acknowledged but contained, where you are trusted within boundaries defined by others, and those boundaries are rarely stated. They are simply enforced through tone, through repetition, through the gentle insistence that this way is easier, that way is safer, this option makes more sense, and over time, sense becomes synonymous with compliance, and you find yourself internalizing the same logic, preemptively adjusting your preferences to align with what will be accepted without question. Because questioning now carries a social cost, not open conflict but subtle recalibration, a change in atmosphere, a slight tension that suggests you are making things harder than they need to be, and recognition deepens when you see how language participates in this shift. How words like help and support and care are used to justify decisions that remove you from the center. How concern replaces consent. How planning replaces asking. How arrangements are made with the assumption that you will appreciate them, and appreciation becomes the expected response, even when the arrangement does not reflect what you would have chosen, because choosing is no longer the point. Smoothness is, and smoothness requires predictability. And predictability requires that your preferences remain stable, manageable, secondary. And you notice how often people speak for you, not aggressively, but confidently. How they answer questions before you do. How they frame your needs in ways that simplify them. How they describe your limits without asking where you feel them. And each instance is small enough to overlook. But recognition gathers them into a coherent picture. A picture where your role is shifting from participant to consideration, from agent to variable. And you begin to understand that this shift is not driven by disrespect. It is driven by fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of responsibility. Fear of watching someone they care about struggle. And fear is persuasive, because it convinces everyone involved that control is kindness, that intervention is prevention, that decision-making is a burden you no longer need to carry, and because you are capable of empathy, because you understand fear, you allow this reasoning to stand, even as it quietly rearranges your position, and recognition becomes uncomfortable not because it reveals cruelty, but because it reveals how easily dignity is compromised by comfort, how easily autonomy is exchanged for convenience, and how often this exchange is framed as progress, as adaptation, as the natural order of things. And you see how routine plays its part, how schedules become fixed around you, how flexibility disappears without discussion, how your time is treated as available rather than owned. And you recognize that routine is powerful because it removes the need for choice, and removing the need for choice removes the need for permission, and soon permission is no longer sought, it is assumed, and recognition sharpens further when you notice how your own responses have changed. How often you hesitate before expressing a preference, how often you soften your language, how often you add disclaimers, how often you say it does not matter even when it does, and you realize that this self-editing is not humility, it is adaptation to a role that expects ease over assertion, and you begin to see how the role is reinforced not only by others, but by your own desire to avoid tension, your own habit of making things smoother, your own identity as someone who understands, who adjusts, who does not demand, and recognition becomes a mirror, reflecting not just what is happening to you, but how you have participated in it, not through weakness, but through strength used in a context where it now works against you. And this realization is sobering because it removes the possibility of simple blame. It shows you that the system is collaborative, that it relies on shared assumptions, shared habits, shared fears, and shared silence, and recognition settles into your awareness as a pattern rather than an event, a pattern where help gradually becomes control, where concern becomes justification, where the question disappears and the plan takes its place. And you see how easily the role is accepted, because it asks so little of you on the surface. It asks only that you agree, that you appreciate, that you trust, and trust is something you have earned the right to give. Yet here it is, being used to limit, rather than expand your agency. And recognition deepens when you notice how often the language of safety overrides the language of choice, how risk is emphasized, how caution is praised, how restraint is encouraged, and how these values, once internal, begin to govern not just your actions but the expectations others hold of you. And you see how the role is not about being told what to do, it is about being gently steered away from deciding it all. And this is what makes it difficult to resist, because there is nothing explicit to push against, only a steady current that carries you in a direction you did not consciously choose. And recognition is the moment when you realize you are moving, when you feel the current, when you stop assuming that stillness means stability, and you understand that autonomy is not lost through confrontation, it is lost through delegation, through repetition, through the normalization of small concessions that feel reasonable in isolation. And recognition does not yet tell you what to do with this knowledge. It simply asks you to hold it, to allow it to remain present without being dismissed, to let the discomfort exist without being smoothed over, because smoothing over is precisely what allowed the pattern to form. And recognition requires that you resist the impulse to explain it away, to reassure yourself that it does not matter, to minimize it in the name of peace, and instead to acknowledge that something fundamental is being negotiated quietly, not your independence in the dramatic sense, but your authorship, your position as the final reference point for your own life. And recognizing this does not immediately restore that position, but it changes how you see every interaction, every offer of help, every expression of concern, every plan made on your behalf, because now you are aware of the pattern, and awareness alters the meaning of participation. And even if you continue to agree, you do so with eyes open, and that openness begins to shift something internally. A subtle recalibration, where you no longer confuse ease with respect, where you no longer assume that care automatically justifies control, and recognition settles into you as a quiet clarity, not loud enough to provoke action yet, but solid enough to prevent further sleepwalking, because once you see the pattern, you cannot return to not seeing it, and that irreversible seeing is what prepares the ground for everything that follows, even if nothing outward changes yet, because recognition is not a demand. It is a stance, a refusal to remain unaware, a decision to observe honestly how the role is constructed, how it is maintained, and how it is quietly accepted. And in that observation, there is already a shift, small but real, away from passivity and toward internal authority, even before any outward refusal occurs. Loss does not announce itself with collapse or crisis. It arrives through repositioning, through the slow realization that you are no longer addressed in the same way, that the tone has shifted even when the words remain polite, that conversations now orbit around you rather than include you at their center. And the weight of this loss is not physical, it is relational. It is the feeling of being handled rather than engaged, of being managed rather than consulted. And what makes it heavy is not that others are unkind, but that they are efficient, that they speak with a certainty that leaves little room for your uncertainty. And in doing so, they remove the space where your judgment once lived, and you feel it most clearly in moments that should be neutral, moments where your opinion would once have been sought without ceremony, and now it is summarized, interpreted, or anticipated before you can offer it. And you notice how often people speak to you as if clarity must be delivered to you rather than drawn from you, how instructions are softened but still instructions, how reassurance replaces dialogue. And this is when the loss becomes emotional, because you recognize yourself in the gap between who you know yourself to be and how you're now approached. And that gap creates a quiet grief, not for strength or capacity, but for position, for the sense of standing on equal ground. And the grief is complicated because it cannot be easily justified, because nothing overt has been taken, because you are still present, still involved, still included. And yet inclusion now carries a different texture, a sense that your presence is accommodated rather than required, that your voice is welcomed but not necessary. And this is where the loss settles, in the realization that being present is not the same as being pivotal, and being heard is not the same as being heeded. And you feel it in the way people speak more slowly, in the way they repeat themselves unnecessarily, in the way they explain things you already understand, not out of condescension, but out of assumption. And assumption is powerful because it reshapes interaction without accusation, and over time these small signals accumulate into an emotional landscape where you feel yourself shrinking, not because you are less, but because the space allotted to you has narrowed. And the narrowing is justified by care, by practicality, by the belief that this is how things should be now. And you absorb this belief gradually, even as it conflicts with your internal reality, and the conflict produces fatigue, a tiredness that comes from constantly adjusting your internal sense of self to match an external narrative that no longer reflects you accurately. And you begin to feel the loss in language itself, in the way your words are received, in the way your suggestions are met with pauses, with gentle counter-proposals, with subtle steering towards safer ground, and you realize that safety has become the dominant value, overriding curiosity, overriding risk, overriding experimentation. And while safety has its place, its dominance comes at a cost, because it narrows the field of possibility. And possibility is where autonomy breathes, and the loss deepens when you notice how often decisions are framed as final before you arrive, how plans are presented as settled, how your role is to adapt rather than to shape. And adaptation has always been one of your skills, but now it is being used to justify your marginalization, and this realization carries a quiet sting, because you recognize that your strengths are being repurposed to support a role you did not choose, and you begin to feel the emotional impact of being repositioned as someone who is to be accommodated rather than collaborated with. And this repositioning changes how you are seen and how you see yourself, because identity is relational. It is reinforced through interaction, and when interactions consistently place you in a passive role, your internal sense of agency begins to dull, not because you forget who you are, but because you have fewer opportunities to exercise that identity. And the loss becomes palpable in moments of silence when you notice that you no longer volunteer opinions as readily, that you wait to be asked, that you hold back not because you have nothing to say, but because you have learned that speaking may not change the outcome, and withholding becomes a form of self-protection. Yet it also deepens the loss, because expression is how agency stays alive, and when expression diminishes, agency follows, and you feel the emotional weight of this in your body, not as pain but as a subtle heaviness, a sense of being slightly removed from your own life. And this removal is reinforced by how others reference you, how they describe you in the third person, even when you are present, how they discuss your needs, your preferences, your limitations, as if they are established facts rather than evolving realities. And you recognize that this way of speaking freezes you in time, locks you into a version of yourself that feels incomplete, and being fixed in this way is a form of loss, because growth does not stop with age, yet the narrative around you suggests that it should, that stability is now the goal, that change is risky, that experimentation is unnecessary, and this narrative strips away a dimension of your humanity, the dimension that allows for surprise, for contradiction, for becoming something new. And the loss is not dramatic, but it is persistent, and it shows itself in how often you feel the need to reassure others that you are fine, that you can manage, that you understand, as if your continued competence must be defended. And defending competence is itself a sign that it is being questioned. And this questioning seeps into your self-perception, not enough to undermine your confidence entirely, but enough to create doubt in moments where there was once ease, and you notice how often you double-check yourself, how often you wonder whether you are being unreasonable, whether your preference is outdated, whether your insistence is unnecessary. And this self-questioning is the internal echo of the external repositioning. And it carries its own emotional toll because it forces you to negotiate your identity constantly, to reconcile who you feel yourself to be with how you are being treated. And the reconciliation is exhausting, and the loss becomes clearer when you remember how it felt to be consulted, to be relied upon, to be deferred to, not as a matter of ego, but as a matter of mutual respect. And you recognize that respect has not vanished, but it has been reframed, softened into politeness, diluted into care, and politeness does not require engagement, it only requires consideration. And consideration is not the same as partnership, and the emotional weight of this distinction settles into you slowly. Because it is not acknowledged openly, and what is not acknowledged cannot be resolved. It can only be endured, and endurance has always been part of your life. But here, it becomes a substitute for agency, and you realize that enduring a diminished role is still a form of loss, even if it is endured gracefully. And the grace with which you endure becomes another justification for maintaining the status quo, because your lack of resistance is read as comfort, as acceptance, as agreement. And this misreading deepens the loss, because it erases your internal experience, and you find yourself feeling unseen in a new way, not invisible but misperceived, and misperception is isolating, because it separates you from others even in their presence, and the loss takes on a quiet loneliness, not the loneliness of absence, but the loneliness of being present without being fully recognized, and you feel it when conversations move on without you, when decisions are finalized without your input, when your role is assumed rather than defined, and you realize that the expected role carries an emotional cost that is rarely discussed, because it is not dramatic enough to command attention, and yet it shapes daily experience. It alters how you relate to yourself and to others, and the loss is cumulative, not catastrophic. And because it is cumulative, it is easy to deny, easy to rationalize, easy to overlook. Yet once you allow yourself to feel it fully, without minimizing it, without explaining it away, you recognize that something essential has been eroding, not your relevance, not your worth, but your sense of authorship, and that erosion produces a quiet sadness, a sober awareness that being managed is not the same as being cared for, that being protected is not the same as being respected, and that being repositioned, even gently, even kindly, still constitutes a loss because it alters the balance between who you are and how the world responds to you. And acknowledging this loss does not require despair, but it does require honesty, the honesty to admit that something meaningful has shifted, that the emotional impact is real. That dignity can be diminished without anyone intending harm, and that this diminution leaves a residue, a feeling that must be carried, examined, and understood before anything else can change, because loss unacknowledged does not disappear. It settles deeper, shaping behavior, shaping silence, shaping acceptance. And in recognizing the loss, you begin to reclaim something internal, not yet autonomy, but awareness of what has been given up. And awareness is the first step toward deciding whether that loss will continue quietly or whether it will eventually meet a different response. Clarity does not arrive as resolution or confidence, it arrives as stillness, as the moment when the noise of reaction settles enough for something steadier to surface. And what becomes clear is not a strategy or a plan, but a distinction that had been blurred. The distinction between what can be taken and what must be surrendered, between external positioning and internal authority, and this clarity feels almost anticlimactic because it does not restore anything visibly. It does not reverse the patterns you have noticed. It simply reorients where you locate yourself within them, and you begin to understand that autonomy was never housed entirely in the visible acts of choosing, never fully dependent on who asks or who decides, but anchored deeper in the quiet assumption that you are the final reference point for your own experience, and this assumption can be weakened by habit, by accommodation, by silence, but it cannot be removed unless you participate in its removal, and clarity is the recognition of that boundary, the boundary where influence ends and surrender begins. And you see now that much of what has felt like loss has occurred on the surface, in language, in routine, in expectation, while something essential has remained intact beneath it, waiting not to be defended, but to be remembered. And this remembering shifts your posture internally, because you stop confusing compliance with peace, and you stop assuming that agreement is the price of harmony. And clarity allows you to hold two truths at once, that others may continue to organize, to plan, to suggest, to protect, and that none of this requires you to relinquish your internal authorship unless you decide to. And this decision is not announced, it is not performed, it is simply made quietly in the way you listen, in the way you respond, in the way you no longer rush to justify your preferences. And clarity shows you that autonomy is not exercised only in refusal, it is exercised in presence, in the calm refusal to disappear internally even when others speak around you. And you realize that dignity does not demand confrontation. It demands alignment between what you feel, what you think, and what you accept. And when that alignment is restored internally, the external dynamics lose some of their power, not because they change, but because they no longer define you. And clarity deepens as you see how often you had been negotiating yourself downward in anticipation of others' expectations, how often you had preemptively softened your stance, and you recognize that this was never required. It was simply habitual, and habits can be interrupted not by force but by attention, and attention is what clarity provides. A steady attention to your own internal responses, to the moment you feel yourself shrinking, to the moment you feel yourself deferring unnecessarily. And clarity does not judge these moments, it observes them, and in observation there is choice, not the loud choice of action, but the quiet choice of stance, and you begin to inhabit your own experience more fully. To notice that even when decisions are made without you, your internal position remains yours, that your consent is not automatic, that acceptance can be selective even when compliance appears complete, and this understanding brings a subtle calm, because it removes the urgency to fight what cannot be easily changed, and instead focuses on what is always within reach, your internal orientation. Your sense of self-authorship, your refusal to confuse convenience with truth and clarity, also reveals that much of the power you attributed to others was borrowed, sustained by your own silence, your own desire for ease. And this realization is not shaming. It is liberating because it means that the source of authority has not disappeared. It has simply been quieted. And quiet things can be heard again when you slow down enough to listen. And clarity is that slowing, that deliberate pause where you stop reacting to how you are being positioned and start attending to how you are positioning yourself internally. And you notice that when you do not rush to fill silences, when you do not immediately agree, when you allow your own thoughts to settle before responding, the dynamic shifts subtly, not always externally, but internally. And this internal shift matters more because it restores a sense of solidity, a feeling that you are not being carried along unconsciously, that you are present in your own life, even when others attempt to streamline it. And clarity shows you that independence is not measured by how many decisions you make openly, but by whether you recognize yourself as the one who grants legitimacy to those decisions. And you see now that dignity is preserved not by insisting on control, but by maintaining awareness, by knowing when you are choosing and when you are allowing, and by allowing consciously rather than habitually. And this conscious allowance feels different. It feels grounded, deliberate, and clarity brings with it a quiet confidence. Not the confidence of assertion, but the confidence of containment, the knowledge that you do not need to prove your agency for it to exist, that you do not need to perform independence for it to be real, and this knowledge softens your interactions, not by making you more passive, but by making you less reactive. And you realize that reaction was draining because it kept you oriented toward others, while clarity turns you back toward yourself. And in that turning there is relief, because you are no longer measuring your worth by how much influence you retain externally, but by how firmly you remain anchored internally. And clarity also reframes aging itself, not as a narrowing, but as a test of internal alignment, a period where external validation diminishes, but internal authority can deepen if you allow it. And this reframing does not romanticize the losses. It does not deny the realities of being repositioned, but it places them in a larger context, where they are seen as conditions rather than definitions. And clarity allows you to inhabit this context without bitterness, without resignation, because bitterness still gives power to what it resents, and resignation gives power to what it accepts blindly, while clarity simply sees and in seeing chooses where to stand. And you stand now not in opposition, not in retreat, but in quiet ownership of your internal space. And this ownership does not require acknowledgement. It does not require permission. It exists regardless of how others behave, and clarity settles into you as a steady awareness that autonomy lives first in how you relate to yourself, in whether you treat your own thoughts with respect, whether you honor your own perceptions, whether you remain present to your own experience even when others attempt to simplify it. And this clarity is not dramatic. It does not change your circumstances overnight, but it changes your relationship to them. And that change is subtle but profound, because it marks the moment when autonomy stops being something you hope to protect externally and becomes something you inhabit internally. And from that place, whatever comes next will be quieter, steadier, and less dependent on permission. Quiet autonomy is not a stance you announce or a role you step into publicly. It is something that settles into you gradually once clarity has done its work, and it feels less like a decision and more like a return to an internal posture that existed long before roles were assigned or expectations formed, a posture where you do not need to push against the world to remain intact, because your sense of self no longer depends on constant reinforcement from others. And this quiet autonomy is subtle enough that it may go unnoticed by those around you, because nothing outward changes dramatically. You still participate, you still listen, you still accept help when it is offered, but the difference is internal, in the way you no longer confuse assistance with authority, in the way you no longer assume that care grants others the right to define you, and this internal shift brings with it a steadiness that does not seek validation, because validation is no longer the source of your dignity, and dignity becomes something you carry rather than something you negotiate. And this carrying changes how you move through interactions, because you stop bracing yourself against being misunderstood, and instead you allow misunderstanding to exist without threatening your sense of self. And this allowance creates space not for others to take more from you, but for you to remain whole regardless of how others behave. And quiet autonomy expresses itself in small ways, in the pauses you allow before responding, in the absence of urgency to explain yourself, in the way you let decisions unfold without immediately internalizing them as judgments on your competence. And this absence of urgency is not withdrawal, it is presence without tension. And tension had been the hidden cost of the earlier role, the constant low-level vigilance required to maintain harmony while feeling yourself slowly recede. And now that vigilance relaxes, because you are no longer monitoring how much of yourself you are allowed to show, you simply exist as you are without apology or display, and this existence feels grounded, because it is no longer oriented toward proving anything. And quiet autonomy also alters how you relate to choice itself, because choice is no longer something you must assert loudly to preserve. It is something you exercise internally, even when external circumstances limit your options. And you recognize that consent is not only something you give outwardly, it is something you grant inwardly. And you become more attentive to where you are consenting unconsciously, where you are agreeing out of habit rather than alignment. And this attentiveness does not lead to constant refusal. It leads to selective acceptance, to agreements that feel clean rather than resigned. And this cleanliness is the mark of quiet autonomy, the feeling that when you say yes, it is because you mean it, not because it is expected. And when you say no, even if it is unspoken, it is grounded in self-respect rather than defiance. And you realize that refusal does not always require words. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to internalize a diminished view of yourself, the refusal to see your own experience through the lens of others' expectations. And this refusal is silent, steady, and deeply personal, and it reshapes your internal landscape so that external pressures no longer penetrate as easily. And quiet autonomy also brings a shift in how you experience time, because time is no longer something that is being managed for you. It becomes something you inhabit on your own terms, even within structured routines. And you notice that you no longer rush to fill your days with meaning as defined by others. You allow meaning to emerge from your own attention, from the way you engage with small moments, from the way you honor your own rhythms. And this honoring restores a sense of ownership that had been diluted by schedules and plans made on your behalf. And the restoration is gentle. It does not demand that others change. It simply requires that you remain present to yourself, and presence becomes the foundation of your autonomy, because where you are present, you are not easily displaced, and this presence is felt in the way you listen without absorbing, in the way you observe without shrinking, in the way you remain centered, even when others attempt to simplify or categorize you. And quiet autonomy also softens your relationship to loss, because you no longer measure yourself solely by what you can control externally. You measure yourself by how faithfully you remain aligned internally. And this alignment provides a resilience that does not depend on circumstances. And you find that you can accept limitations without feeling diminished. You can accept help without feeling erased. You can accept change without feeling displaced, because your sense of self is no longer anchored to a specific role or position. It is anchored to an internal continuity that persists regardless of how you are addressed or managed. And this continuity brings a calm authority that is not performative. It does not announce itself, but it is felt, and those who interact with you may sense it without being able to name it. A steadiness that does not seek to dominate or withdraw, but simply exists. And this existence subtly alters dynamics because people respond differently to someone who is internally settled. Even if they cannot articulate why, and even if external behaviors remain the same, the emotional tone shifts because you are no longer negotiating your worth in each interaction, and this negotiation had been exhausting, and its absence brings relief and quiet autonomy. Also reframes how you see aging itself, not as a process of relinquishment, but as a refinement of what truly belongs to you. A period where external influence may increase, but internal authority can deepen if you choose to inhabit it. And this choice is not dramatic, it is made daily in small moments of attention, in the decision to trust your own perceptions, in the willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately smoothing it over, in the refusal to dismiss your own experience as irrelevant or outdated. And these small choices accumulate not into rebellion, but into integrity. And integrity is the quietest form of autonomy, because it does not require witnesses. And this integrity allows you to move through a world that means well without being absorbed by its expectations, to accept care without surrendering authorship, to participate without disappearing. And this balance is delicate. It requires ongoing awareness, but it is sustainable, because it does not depend on others' behavior. It depends on your own attention. And attention is something that remains available regardless of age or circumstance. And quiet autonomy also brings a new relationship to dignity, because dignity is no longer something that can be conferred or withdrawn by others. It is something you enact internally through how you treat yourself, through the seriousness with which you take your own thoughts, through the patience with which you allow your own feelings to exist. And this enactment is subtle. It does not seek recognition, but it creates a sense of solidity that cannot be easily undermined. And you realize that the role you were expected to accept loses its power once you stop identifying with it internally, because roles require participation to function, and your participation has shifted from unconscious acceptance to conscious presence. And this shift is enough. It does not need to be defended or explained. And quiet autonomy also frees you from the need to correct others constantly, because correction implies dependence on their understanding, while autonomy allows you to let misunderstandings exist without internalizing them. And this freedom reduces friction, not by making you more agreeable, but by making you less invested in outcomes that do not define you. And you find that you can engage more honestly, because honesty no longer feels risky when your sense of self is secure, and this honesty is quiet. It is expressed through consistency rather than assertion, through alignment rather than argument, and it allows you to inhabit your life with a renewed sense of ownership, even as external structures remain unchanged. And this ownership is the culmination of the journey, not a destination reached through action, but a state maintained through attention. And quiet autonomy does not promise comfort. It does not eliminate loss or frustration, but it ensures that these experiences do not hollow you out, because you remain connected to yourself through them. And this connection is what allows dignity to persist, even when roles shift, even when voices around you grow louder, even when decisions are made without your input. And in this persistence, there is strength, not the strength of control, but the strength of continuity. The knowledge that you remain yourself regardless of how you are positioned, and this knowledge is enough. It does not seek validation, it does not require recognition, it simply exists, steady and quiet, as the final form of autonomy, the autonomy that cannot be taken because it is no longer dependent on permission, the autonomy that resides in how you inhabit your own experience. And this is what remains when everything else becomes negotiable, the silent ownership of your inner life, your thoughts, your values, your sense of self-respect, carried without display, without resistance, without surrender, simply lived quietly on your own terms.